My name's Leonard Kozianski. Welcome to my studio. This is where I work. And let's talk about visionary art today. Let's look at some visionary art. Let's look at some examples of visionary art throughout history, or at least what I would consider to be visionary art. Now, there are a lot of different definitions of visionary art. Some people feel that it should be mystical and spiritual. Others say that it should be done by self-taught artists who are representing some sort of inner reality. Others feel that visionary work is work that's done from the imagination, things that couldn't possibly be seen in real life. Others feel that surrealist art is very visionary. And so we're going to look at a bunch of different examples of, each of those different kinds of visions and visionary art that has occurred throughout history. Now first, this is one of my paintings. This is called On the Corner, and it was done in 2017. It's 42 inches high by 26 inches wide, oil on canvas, and I consider it to be visionary because it was based on a vision. So I just sort of closed my eyes and there I saw it. I saw what I was supposed to paint. Now, the things are rendered realistically or representationally, but it's from sort of like an impossible perspective where we're looking into the windows of the different people's lives and seeing what they're doing. A woman on there on the left is getting dressed, and another woman washing dishes, a child watching TV. And we look in the distance, and there are those houses that are all identical. They're very symbolic. So if something is symbolic, does that make it visionary? Because a lot of visionary art is very symbolic, because it's painting things that are very unreal. Well, here's a classic example of visionary art. This is The Garden of Earthly Delights by harmonious Bosch, painted in 1490. And in it, we see a depiction of, it depends on how you interpret it. There are a lot of different interpretations of this. Well, one of the interpretations that I like is that this is a depiction of what the world would be like if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned. So there we see Adam and Eve over there on the left, and then we see what resulted from their sin, which is hell over there on the right. And then in the center, we see this vision of, this sort of like this idyllic garden with all these images of pleasure taking place. So is this sort of the Garden of Eden if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned? Is this the world that we would live in? Interesting question. Very detailed. A beautiful image, very complex image. It's in Spain. It's in the Prado. Now here is another artist's work. This is by Dürer, and this was in 1498. It's about the same time as the previous painting. And here we see a painting of a scene from the Bible, from the book of Revelations. And the book of Revelations is a very sort of imagery rich, very sort of surreal, intense, spiritual book. And here's one of the scenes from that book. The four horsemen of the apocalypse riding through the sky, bringing on the end of the world. And this is a woodcut. This is carved in wood and then printed. And in woodcut printing, they have to actually carve away those parts that aren't going to be black, because you only have black and white. And look at the detail there. He had to carve all of that. Well, he apprenticed as a goldsmith, so he was used to carving. But this is what a woodcut looks like when it's being printed. Well, here's another example. Now, this is probably the earthiest and the most realistic of all the so-called visionary things that we'll look at. This is called The Census at Bethlehem, and it's a scene from the Bible. It's one of the most spiritual scenes from the Bible. It's Christmas Eve, and Joseph is leading Mary into town, and she's on the back of this donkey. And they're in the lower center of the picture. But he's placing this scene in sort of like a contemporary Dutch town, sort of like a very contemporary Dutch reality. So it's sort of like very down to earth, very matter of fact, rendering of this sort of very significantly spiritual moment. Is that visionary? Because it has to be based on his imagination. Because this is a scene that he couldn't possibly have seen. And this was done in 1566. Now here, this is a classic visionary work. This is God creating Adam. This is by William Blake. This was painted in 1795. This is in watercolor. Here it's very symbolic. The angel's wings, that background, is that the sun or the moon? Are those clouds? It's hard to say. They're very symbolic. And yet, the representation, the rendering of God's face and Adam's face is very realistic. And yet, this is a work from the imagination. So in parts of it, it's very symbolic, very overly simplified. And, Blake was not a self-taught artist. He was a contemporary illustrator and writer. Now here, this is Caspar David Friedrich. And this is called The Abbey of the Oakwood. And it's a very sort of almost representational or matter-of-fact, down-to-earth scene. The subject is not especially mysterious or mystical, but it's painted in a very mystical way. Okay, those trees and the way he's combined the trees with that fragment of architecture creates this very mysterious, romantic, visionary presence. And yet, each of those individual elements is not, in and of itself, spiritual or mystical. It's just the way he combines them that creates this mysterious, mystical presence, where we almost sense the spiritual presence in nature. It's almost like nature is animated by this mysterious, mystical spirit, like nature has a soul. And here's another one of his paintings, a man and woman contemplating the moon. And this one is from, the previous one was, what was that, 1809, and this one is 1824. This is about 20 years later, and maybe 15, 20 years later. But, here are this man and woman looking at the moon. They're in this landscape, which is, again, completely done from the imagination, but very realistically painted. And Caspar David Friedrich, he didn't paint many pictures. It took him a long time. And he didn't paint them in the typical way that a professional artist would, which is, we start off very generally and then gradually get more specific and more detailed as we progress. No, he painted from one corner to the next, completely finishing each part as he went along, based on his vision. And here, this is Samuel Palmer. Now, his style is not realistic. It's not very well rendered. And in fact, it's of a scene that's sort of very matter of fact, just a farmer walking through a cornfield at night. And that's what this is called, a cornfield illuminated by the moonlight. And yet, what a mysterious, mystical presence this painting has, by the way he has combined the moonlight on that corn and the farmer walking through it. It has a very mysterious, mystical presence, again, almost representing the soul of nature. And here, this one by John Martin. Now this is a very visionary work, because he's painting something that's completely fantastic out of his imagination, where Sadak there in the lower part of the picture is climbing up this cliff, and then in the background is this huge, monumental, rocky landscape with that cavern and those cliffs and and fading off into the distance, and yet everything is so precisely painted. It just draws us right in. It draws us right into his vision, his very unrealistic vision, which is based on sort of very realistic rendering principles. And this is from 1812. So, it's from his imagination. It's very visionary, but at the same time, it doesn't have that sort of visionary style that we would associate with visionary works. And he's not self-taught. Now here's another one of his pictures. This is Joshua from the Bible, from the Old Testament, one of the most memorable battles in the Old Testament, where Joshua makes the sun stand still in the sky while he defeats his enemy. And there we can see Joshua in the lower middle of the painting, reaching towards the sky. But look at how nature, the spirit of nature, is swirling all around him. It's almost like we could sense God's presence in nature with the swirling clouds and the rocks. And, so God's presence is so clearly indicated by the forms that nature has taken in this painting. And through these monumental rock and cloud forms and this city off in the distance, we see these tiny little soldiers, these armies marching through into battle. And so, he draws us right in. It's not like we have to suspend our disbelief at all. We're pulled right into this painting. It's a huge painting, but it's so beautifully painted, so realistically painted. Now here, this is by Edward Hicks. He's an early American artist. This is 1834. He lived in Pennsylvania, up in Bucks County. He was a Quaker, and here he's painting a scene from one of the prophecies of Isaiah, where the lion and the lamb will lie down together in peaceful harmony, and babies will be able to consort with tigers and lions without fear, and the predatory animals are going to eat eat hay along with the horses and the cows, and everyone lives in perfect harmony. There's no predation, there's no conflict. And even in the background, over there on the left, we see those colonists with the Indians, and they're trading peacefully. Because in 1834, there was still quite a bit of conflict between the Indians and the colonists, and that's depicted to a great extent in James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. And yet here we have the colonists and the Indians trading very peacefully, not at all warlike manner, along with the harmony in the animals and the babies over there on the right. A visionary work, something from his imagination. And we can even see that the way he has painted those animals is not very realistic at all. It's very precise, it's very detailed. The lines are very sharp, but the actual representations are not realistic in the way that we have seen before, like in the work of John Martin. And here, this is John Everett Millais. Now, he was a Pre-Raphaelite painter, and the Pre-Raphaelites were trying to harken back to art that was before the Renaissance, which after the Renaissance, they felt artwork became kind of decadent. And so they were going back to spiritual art, like Botticelli, and Fra Filippo Lippi, and Cimabue, and the spiritual artists of the early Renaissance. But they're rendering things in a very realistic way. But the scenes that they represented were from the Bible, were from imagination, from literature. And here, this is a painting of Ophelia killing herself, committing suicide. This is from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And there's Ophelia, so just before she's about to die, floating on the water. What realism, what detail. It's almost photographic. In fact, I would imagine he was actually using photographs to help him to paint these things. And yet, it's not what we would normally consider to be sort of like a visionary work, but it's so totally visionary. It's from his imagination, based on something from literature, something he couldn't possibly have seen, painted in a very impossible way, where she's just sort of like floating down the river in this sort of very impossible gesture, and yet painted with such detail, such precise realism. It really just pulls us right in. And then here, this is Arnold Böcklin, The Isle of the Dead, from 1890. And this was a very popular painting at the time. And there's this figure being rowed in a boat, this white figure, this figure all wrapped in white, with that sort of looks like a coffin draped in white, and headed to this island that's full of what looks like these tombs. And it's a very mysterious, mystical image where so the spirit of the underworld animates nature. And yet, at the same time, it's sort of very realistic. He's a classically educated artist, but painting this very surreal, visionary work, a work that was very popular at the time. And then here, this painting from 1910. This is done about 20 years later by Henri Rousseau, called The Dream. Oh, and that Arnold Böcklin that we just looked at, he said that's a dream picture. So he said, I'm painting my dreams. Well, here, this is a painting by Henri Rousseau called The Dream. And it's a jungle scene, and there's this woman lying on this bed in the middle of the jungle, and she's surrounded by all these lush tropical plants, and then there are those two lions in the middle of the painting, and then there's that native playing that sort of like flute or recorder like instrument tucked away in the foliage. And there are animals, there are birds, there's fruit in the trees. And where did he get these forms from? Well, he got them. He looked at the plants in the nearby botanical garden. He looked at his own house plants to help him paint the plants the way he did, with all that detail. But this is a scene from his imagination. This is a dream image, and he is self-taught. He's a self-taught artist. He was a government worker until he retired, and then he started painting. And here, this is a surrealist image. Okay, this is by De Chirico, and he's an Italian surrealist. It's called The Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. So right in the title, there's this element of mystery. So is this a visionary work? It's a surreal image. He combines sort of like his own psychological reality with the reality that he sees, and he's combining them together to create this sort of more truthful, complex reality. A very surreal, very imaginative, visionary work. But this is categorized. It's called surrealism, but it's also very visionary. Are these definitions? Are these words what's important? Because all sorts of things seem to fit into that visionary definition. And here's another work by Salvador Dali. Now this is very visionary. This is based, completely on his imagination. A vision, and it's a very surrealist painting. It's something that's totally impossible, and yet painted in such a realistic manner. Such a convincing manner that it sort of draws us in. It's very convincing, but it's of such an impossible, sort of psychologically distorted reality. And here, this is John Rogers Cox. He's an American, a Midwesterner, and he's painting. He was in Chicago and in the Midwest, and this is called the legacy, the Wheatfield Legacy, and it's from the 1940s, and it's sort of like a very mundane scene, just a wheat field, with some dead branches in the foreground and some clouds in the background, but done in such a mysterious, visionary way that, it's impossible. It's obviously from his imagination. And he's distorting things. Notice how the shape of those clouds echoes the shape of those dead branches in the foreground. And if we could look at that wheat up close in real life, we'd see that it's kind of bumpy. He created physical texture with his paint. So a very visionary work, but of a very sort of like very mundane, everyday occurrence. So is that visionary? If we're, does the subject itself have to be mysterious and spiritual? Or could the spiritual quality of the painting be something that the artist brings to that subject by the way they paint it? Because we saw, God creating Adam. Well, that's a very spiritual subject. Here, this is not a very spiritual subject, and yet painted sort of in a very mysterious spiritual way. So, and then here, this is my piece. Okay, on the corner. Again, it was a vision that I had. I painted a vision that I had, and I painted it in a very representational way. And yet it has a very dreamlike quality. It's very symbolic. It's, in some ways it's very realistic, but at the same time it's very unrealistic too. And is this a visionary work? I think it is, because it's a painting of a vision. And is that what makes something a visionary work of art? Well, that's for us to decide as we look at artwork and decide what we feel is visionary. What is that? What is that term? Does that term represent a style, a type of artwork? It's certainly the name of a museum of artwork, but what is that? Because it seems sort of nebulous, but it incorporates. But that sort of nebulous definition incorporates some of my favorite artworks. Well, thank you for watching this video.
If you like this video, Be sure to subscribe, like, and share.
And don't forget to ring the bell.